His Holiness Moranmar Baselios Marthoma Matthews III, Catholicos of the East and Supreme Head of the Malankara Orthodox Church, His Holiness Georgis Mar Kurilos, Mumbai Diocese Metropolitan and President of the Pithru Smrithi General Committee, the respected bishops present on the stage, Yohanan Mar Polycarpos, Joseph Mar Dionysius, Jakub Mar Elias, Abraham Mar Seraphin, Georgis Mar Theophilus, Georgis Mar Barnabas, the lay members here, Advocate Biju Uman, Father Biju P. Thomas, the Program Committee Convener, Father Dr. Paul Manalil, General Convener, Reverend Father George, Reverend Father Thomas Verghese Anil, ladies and gentlemen, friends, Sahodari Sahodaramare, എല്ലാവർക്കും എൻ്റെ വിനീതമായ നമസ്കാരം. ഇന്ന് ഈ സദസ്സിൽ പലവരും മലയാളം സംസാരിക്കാത്ത കാരണം ഞാൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലാണ് എൻ്റെ പ്രഭാഷണം നിങ്ങളുടെ മുമ്പിൽ വയ്ക്കാൻ പോകുന്നത്. വിരോധമില്ല എന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുന്നു. It is a privilege and an honor to join this distinguished gathering here in Parumala for the Pithru Smrithi and to have the honor of paying homage to the immortal legacy of the late lamented Julius Mar Alvarez and the late lamented Dr. Philippos Mar Theophilus. My grateful thanks to His Holiness Baba Tirumeni and His Holiness Kurilos Tirumeni for inviting me to add my own voice to the many well-wishers and the faithful who have gathered here today to pay tribute to these remarkable prelates of this church. And it is, of course, for us all the more moving that this takes place just 10 days after the passing of an illustrious son of this church, Sri Uman Chandi, my friend and senior colleague and leader in the Congress Party, and I would like in this brief sentence to pay tribute to him and his great soul as well. Let me begin by saying I'm honored to be here with you in Parumala, a place that has evolved over the years not just as a spiritual powerhouse of the church, but also in many ways as a pilgrimage center that is the very heartbeat of this church. And to the faithful who flock to this village in droves each day to pay tribute at the final resting place of a great saint, Saint Gregorius of Parumala, known to everyone here as Parumala Tirumeni, a source of blessing and succor to lakhs of people within the church and beyond. I do not need to touch on the remarkable life of Parumala Tirumeni here before a gathering of the faithful, but I will say that his great life was his calling, a life defined by an extraordinary sense of purpose and a deep spiritual foundation rooted in spreading the light of Christ amongst those living in darkness. His indelible contributions to our society, particularly here in Kerala and particularly in leading and expanding the church's educational outreach efforts without discrimination, either on the grounds of religion or gender, which paved the way for many to uplift themselves from poverty and ignorance, fostering a sense of empowerment and progress in Kerala, as well as his deep commitment to the welfare of the less fortunate, particularly in his championing of various charitable initiatives, helping the poor, orphans, widows. All these are worth celebrating and remembering every day. His dedication to alleviating the suffering of others exemplified his compassion and selflessness. He believed that true spirituality lies in the act of giving and the service of humanity, and his actions inspired countless others to follow in his footsteps. I am pleased to note that successive leaders of the Malankara Orthodox Church, including His Holiness Baba Tirumeni, ably supported by His Holiness Kurilos Tirumeni, have continued to further that deep-rooted commitment to society that was exemplified by the life and actions of Parumala Tirumeni. So before I begin, let me offer my respectful pranams to the great saint. I've had the privilege to speak at several functions of the Malankara Orthodox Church outside Kerala, including delivering the keynote address at a function in New Delhi to hand over the 6th Paulos Mar Gregorios Award to the famous social activist Srimati Aruna Roy in the august presence of your late Catholicos, His Holiness Basilios Paulos II. Coincidentally, that was exactly 4 years back on the 28th of July 2019. But it gives me greater pleasure to address a general meeting of this church at this holy village of Parumala. Today, the Malankara Orthodox Church officially remembers the 100th and 25th death anniversaries of the late lamented Alvarez Mar Julius Alvarez Tirumeni and Dr. Philippos Mar Theophilus Tirumeni, a most timely celebration, especially when we recall that it was on this very day, 134 years back, the 29th of July, so 1 day plus, 29th of July 1889, that Alvarez Mar Julius was consecrated as Metropolitan of Goa, Ceylon and India outside Kerala at the old seminary, the Parumala Seminary in Kottayam. A fact arguably less well known is that Mar Alvarez was elevated to the rank of Ramban, a monk and order, as you all know, prior to the elevation as a bishop, by Parumala Tirumeni on a Saturday, the 27th of July, 1889, 2 days prior to his elevation as a metropolitan. The ordination of Father Alvarez to the order of Ramban is also said to have been conducted at Parumala Seminary in Kottayam. It is also likely that the ordination of Father Alvarez to the order of Ramban was perhaps one of the very few ordinations to have been done personally by Parumala Tirumeni. The choice of Parumala as the venue for this gathering is also noteworthy. Let us not forget that Alvarez Tirumeni was a bishop who frequently interacted with Parumala Tirumeni in those days, and this venue where we are gathered today may well have been the center of those meetings. And possibly as a result of their frequent interactions, there delivered a strong bond between these two eminent prelates, which offers one possible explanation for why Parumala Tirumeni traveled all the way to erstwhile Ceylon, Sri Lanka today, to join Alvarez Tirumeni in the ordination of the French priest, Father René Villat, as Bishop Timotheus in 1892. Similarly, Parumala must have also been close to the heart of Theophilus Tirumeni, who would preside over the customary student meeting held here at Parumala, post the Parumala Perunal, in the over 25 years that he served as the head of the Mar Gregorius Student Society. He was also influential in the establishment of the World Council of Churches in Geneva, with which in my early United Nations career I had the privilege of cooperating extensively. Many of you remember that illustrious son of the church who served as the senior-most Indian of the World Council of Churches, the late Nainan Koshi, who became a good friend of mine in the 1970s and 80s in Geneva. Most importantly, it must have been the greatest moment in the life of Theophilus Tirumeni when he had the privilege to lead the Synod of Bishops to consecrate Basilios Mar Thoma II as Catholicos here at Parumala on the 29th of April 1991. I am pleased that the Malankara Orthodox Church has chosen to celebrate the lives and legacy of these two giants of the church here in Parumala, a fitting venue to remember their many contributions to the church. Now, in reading about the lives of these two prelates, I was immediately struck by certain common themes that emerged from their lives. Of course, as many of you know, they both came from very different backgrounds, and they trod very different paths in their journey within the church. For instance, Alvarez Tirumeni began his journey from the outside, originally as Father Antonio Francisco Xavier Alvarez of Goa, a Catholic priest, who was accepted into the Malankara Orthodox Church and then consecrated, as we've mentioned, as the Metropolitan of Ceylon, Goa, and India, excluding Malabar. It was the first time in its 1900 years of history that the Malankara Church opened its doors to somebody from outside the community and outside the geographical boundary of Travancore, Cochin. In contrast, Theophilus Tirumeni began his journey from within, starting off as a young student leader within the church, someone who also possessed exemplary academic capabilities that saw him travel and study at premier institutions in the UK and the US before being ordained as Metropolitan in 1966, serving first as head of the diocese in Angamali and then tasked with overseeing the important Mumbai diocese in 1979, and earlier, as I mentioned, helping establish the World Council of Churches in Geneva. Despite their very different journeys, in understanding and reading about them, one could make the case that there are three common themes that you can identify shared between these two leaders. Without a doubt, both prelates were first and foremost significant contributors to the outward expansion and consolidation of the church beyond the boundaries of Kerala. I'd already mentioned the role of Mar Alvarez in consecrating René Villat Timotheus as the Bishop of Wisconsin, USA, with the metropolitan title of Mar Timotheus in 1892 at Ceylon. This in many ways sowed the seeds for the outward expansion of the church to its current status that includes 3 dioceses and 3 metropolitans outside India. Similarly, Father Cora Philippos, later Dr. Philippos Mar Theophilus, is often remembered as the ambassador of the Malankara Orthodox Church. As a deacon, he attended the World Conference on Faith and Order in Edinburgh in 1937, when he was just about 25 years old, where it is said that 123 churches from 43 countries participated. Mar Theophilus represented this church at WCC assemblies at Amsterdam, Evanston, New Delhi, Uppsala, and Nairobi from 1948 to 1975. And in this period, he also served on the Central Committee twice, and once headed the Committee on Division of Interchurch Aid, Refugees and World Service. This is an unparalleled contribution by a Malayali to the church and its international relations. He could relate and interact with theologians, bishops, patriarchs seamlessly, and in the process built up an excellent relationship with several other Orthodox and non-Orthodox churches worldwide. At the same time, both of these leaders were driven by a deep sense of social responsibility, particularly towards the weak and the marginalized. This would be the second trait in common. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Mar Alvarez's role as a selfless philanthropist and educationist, who, despite himself living on very modest means, gave his all to the welfare of the downtrodden, including the exemplary manner in which he would respond to crises like the outbreak of cholera and famine in Goa. Similarly, Mar Theophilus, who was a grassroots leader above all, did not build opulent churches and golden flagposts. Instead, he chose to spend his life building institutions in response to the needs of his time. Privileged as he was in receiving superior education, both in India and abroad, Mar Theophilus understood the importance of a good education. It was this vision that led him to set up 3 student centers, Kottayam, Thiruvananthapuram, and Aluva. And finally, the third common trait, it can be argued that both these giants were patriots, for whom the welfare of the people around them mattered far more than distinctions of religion, caste, community. They did not just cater to the faithful, but were moved by a much larger sense of purpose of giving back to the nation that is well worth remembering today. Take the life of Mar Alvarez, for instance, a patriot at heart and an alert observer of the political scene. Mar Alvarez could not remain a conformist against his convictions. He used the most powerful weapon, his pen, to air his opinions. He published the magazines The Cross, Our Cruz, The Truth, Our Verdad, along with a few others that called out injustice in society. There is a reference to Mar Alvarez in the Travancore State Manual, which is like this, quote, Alvarez, a Brahmin by descent, an educated man and the editor of a Catholic journal, unquote. Being a Brahmin by descent was significant in those times. Being educated and by being a Catholic by faith, Alvarez could have had a much more comfortable life had he not followed his convictions to join the Malankara Church. Instead, Mar Julius Alvarez chose the difficult path like his Lord and Master. Mar Theophilus was also no different. With his British and American education and excellent connections with international church organizations from a very young age, he could have found comfortable and rewarding placement in greener pastures, which would not have been difficult. He chose to serve this ecclesiastically rich but financially poor church. While the title of vice principal and principal of the then 150-year-old Syrian seminary might appear attractive, the seminary itself lived from hand to mouth. There was nothing like a principal's house, and Father Philippos lived in a small room instead there. Mar Theophilus had an extremely difficult life as the Metropolitan of Angamali. He endured it all with a smile because of his deep faith in God. Now, in remembering and recalling these admirable attributes of these two fine pillars of the church, I am honored to join with you today to add my own humble tribute to their legacy. It is my hope that more efforts will be undertaken to understand their contributions, not just here among the faithful, but also outside the church as well, so that many more will have the opportunity to be inspired by their lifetime of service to the church, to Kerala, and to the people of our nation. Now, the organizers have asked me to briefly use the special occasion to share with you some of my thoughts on India's diverse and pluralistic heritage. And there is arguably no better way of understanding India than through the lens of its diversity. After all, no other country in the world embraces the extraordinary mixture of ethnic groups, the profusion of mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of topography and climate, the diversity of religions and cultural practices, and the range of levels of economic development that India does. And yet, I have always argued India is more than the sum of its contradictions. Just thinking about our country makes it clear the immensity of the challenge of defining what it means to be an Indian, which I've attempted to do in two books 25 years apart, India from Midnight to the Millennium, and then The Battle of Belonging 2 years ago. How can one approach this land of snow peaks and tropical jungles with 23 major languages and 22,000 distinct dialects, including some spoken by more people than speak Danish or Norwegian? Inhabited in the third decade of the 21st century by over 1 billion individuals of every ethnic extraction known to humanity. How does one come to terms with a country whose population is nearly 30% illiterate, well, 25% or so illiterate, but which has educated the world's second largest pool of trained scientists and engineers? A country whose teeming cities overflow while 2 out of 3 Indians scratch a living from the soil. What is the clue to understanding our country? A country rife with despair and disrepair, which nonetheless moved a Mughal emperor to declaim, "If on earth there be paradise of bliss, it is this, it is this, it is this." How can one determine the future of an ageless civilization that was the birthplace of 4 major religions and home to 3 others, a dozen different traditions of classical dance, 85 major political parties, and 300 ways of cooking the potato? The short answer is that it can't be done, at least not to everyone's satisfaction. Any truism about India can be immediately contradicted by another truism about India. It is often jokingly said that anything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. Our country's national motto, emblazoned on our governmental crest, is Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs. But the question remains, however, whose truth? It's a question to which there are at least 1.4 billion answers, if the last census hasn't undercounted us again. But that sort of an answer is no answer at all, and so another answer to these questions has to be sought. And this may lie in a simple insight. The singular thing about India is that you can only speak of it in the plural. There are, in the hackneyed phrase, many Indias. Everything exists in countless variants. There is no single standard, no fixed stereotype, no one way of doing things. This pluralism is acknowledged in the way in which India arranges its own affairs. All groups, faiths, tastes, ideologies survive and contend for their place in the sun. Many observers have been astonished by India's survival as a pluralist state. But India could hardly have survived as anything else. Pluralism is a reality that emerges from the very nature of our country. It is a choice made inevitable by India's geography and reaffirmed by its history. India's is a civilization that over millennia has offered refuge and, more important, religious and cultural freedom to Jews, Parsis, several varieties of Christians, and of course to Muslims. Jews came to Kerala, it is said, centuries before Christ, with the destruction by the Babylonians of their temple, their first temple, and again after the Romans destroyed their second temple, and they knew no anti-Semitic persecution on Indian soil until the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century to inflict it. Christianity is said to have arrived on Indian soil with St. Thomas the Apostle, Doubting Thomas, who came to the Kerala coast and it is said was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. He made many converts then, so there are Indians today whose ancestors were Christian well before any Europeans had discovered Christianity. In Kerala, Islam came through traders, travelers, missionaries, and not by the sword. The same people who had been trading with Kerala for centuries before the birth of Islam brought the news of Islam as news from the Arab Peninsula. And the fact is that one of our kings, Cheruman Perumal, was so interested that he got onto a ship and went off to Arabia to meet the Prophet in his lifetime. And the evidence to confirm the story is that today there are still Kerala coconut trees growing where he landed south of Salalah on the coastline of Oman, where of course Kerala coconut trees are not otherwise found. In fact, the Zamorin of Calicut was so impressed by the seafaring skills of the Kunyali Marikar community that he issued a decree urging or requiring each fisherman's family to bring up one son as a Muslim so he could have an all-Muslim navy. This is our Kerala, this is our India, a land whose heritage of diversity means that in the Calcutta neighborhood where I spent my high school years, the wail of the muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer routinely blended with the chant of mantras and the tinkling of bells at the local Shiva temple, which is accompanied in turn by the Sikh Gurudwaras reading of verses from the Guru Granth Sahib on a loudspeaker down the road, and St. Paul's Cathedral was just round the corner. So the first challenge is we cannot generalize about India. The only generalization you can safely make about India is that nothing can be taken for granted about our country. Not even its name, for the very word India comes from the river Indus, which flows in Pakistan. Now that anomaly is easily explained. We know that Pakistan was hacked off the stooped shoulders of India by the departing British in 1947. So we can't generalize, we must ask the question, who then is an Indian? In our 7.5 decades of independence, many thoughtful observers have seen a country more conscious than ever of what divides it. Religion, region, caste, language, ethnicity, even history. What then makes India a nation? To answer that question, there are many ways we could answer it, but let me take a couple of examples to illustrate my point. When India celebrated the 49th anniversary of its independence from British rule, that was now 1996, our then Prime Minister was H.D. Deva Gowda, who, as you know, was from Karnataka. And he stood at the ramparts of Delhi's 17th century Red Fort and delivered the traditional Independence Day address to the nation in Hindi. Of course, it's one of India's 2 official languages, often mischaracterized as our national language. 8 other prime ministers had done exactly the same thing 48 times before him. But what was unusual was that Deva Gowda from Karnataka spoke to the country in a language of which he did not know a word. He couldn't speak Hindi, but tradition and politics required a speech in Hindi. So he gave one with the words having been written out for him in his native Kannada script, in which they, of course, made no sense. Now, such an episode is almost inconceivable in any other country, but it represents the best of the oddities that helped make India India. Only in India could the country be ruled by a man who did not understand its largest language. Only in India, for that matter, is there an official language which half the population does not understand, and only in India could this particular solution be found to enable the Prime Minister to address his people. One of Indian cinema's finest playback singers was, of course, our very own Keralite K.J. Yesudas. I remember meeting him as a young man and seeing his songbook. He sang his way to the top of the Hindi film music charts with lyrics in Hindi written in the Malayalam script for him to sing. But to see that same practice elevated to the prime ministerial address on Independence Day was a startling affirmation of Indian pluralism. For you see, we are all minorities in India. A typical Indian stepping off a train, a Hindi-speaking Hindu male from the Gangetic Plain state of Uttar Pradesh, might cherish the illusion that he represents the majority community, to use an expression much favored by the less industrious of our journalists. I meant. But he does not. As a Hindu, he belongs to the faith adhered to by some 80% of the population, but a majority of the country does not speak Hindi. A majority does not hail from Uttar Pradesh, though you could be forgiven for thinking otherwise. And if he were visiting, say, Kerala, he would discover that a majority of the country in this part of the India is not even male. Worse, our archetypal UP Hindu has only to mingle with the polyglot, multicolored crowds, and I'm referring to the color of their skins, not their clothes, thronging any of India's major railway stations to realize how much of a minority he really is. Even his minority status is guaranteed by the fact that he belongs to the Hindu majority, because his caste automatically places him in a minority as well. If he's a Brahmin, 90% of his fellow Indians are not. If he's a backward class, 85% of Indians are not, or so on. അപ്പോൾ ഞാൻ പറയുന്നത് ചിലവർക്ക് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഭാരതത്തിൽ എല്ലാവരും ന്യൂനപക്ഷികളാണെന്നാണ് ഞാൻ പറയുന്നത്. കാരണം ഏത് വിധത്തിലും ഒരു വ്യക്തിക്ക് ഞാൻ ഈ രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ഭൂരിപക്ഷത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു പ്രതിനിധിയാണെന്ന് പറയാനുള്ള അവകാശമില്ല. അഥവാ ഒരു യു പിക്കാരൻ ട്രെയിനിൽ നിന്ന് ഇറങ്ങിയാൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ വിചാരമായിരിക്കും ഞാനൊരു ഹിന്ദുവാണ്, ഞാൻ ഹിന്ദി സംസാരിക്കും, ഞാനാണ് ഈ രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഭൂരിപക്ഷത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രതിനിധി. പക്ഷെ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞത് അദ്ദേഹം 2-3 കാര്യം മറക്കണ്ട. ഉത്തർപ്രദേശിൽ പല കൂട്ടരുണ്ട്, പക്ഷേ നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്തെ ഭൂരിപക്ഷമല്ല. അദ്ദേഹം ഒരു ഹിന്ദി സംസാരിക്കുന്ന വ്യക്തിയാണെങ്കിലും നമ്മളുടെ ഭൂരിപക്ഷം ഹിന്ദി സംസാരിക്കില്ല. രാജ്യത്തിൽ 45% സംസാരിക്കുള്ളൂ. അദ്ദേഹം പുരുഷനാണെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ കേരളത്തിലൊരു ട്രെയിൻ സ്റ്റേഷനിൽ ഇറങ്ങിയാൽ കാണും ഇവിടെ ഭൂരിപക്ഷം മലയാളികൾ ഇടയിൽ മഹിളകളാണ് ഭൂരിപക്ഷം, പിന്നെ പുരുഷന്മാരല്ല. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഹിന്ദുവായ കാരണം മജോറിറ്റി കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റി എന്ന് പറയാനും ഭൂരിപക്ഷത്തിൻ്റെ സമുദായത്തിന് അംഗം എന്ന് പറയാനുള്ള അവകാശമില്ല. കാരണം അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ജാതി നോക്കിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഏത് ജാതിയും ഭൂരിപക്ഷമല്ല. ഒരു ബ്രാഹ്മണാണെങ്കിൽ 90% ഭാരതീയർ ബ്രാഹ്മണന്മാരല്ല. അദ്ദേഹം ഒരു OBC ഒരു യാദവ് ആണെങ്കിലോ വിചാരിച്ചോളൂ, 85% അങ്ങനെ ഓരോരോ ശതമാനം നോക്കിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ഏത് വിധത്തിലും അദ്ദേഹത്തിനെ ഒരു ഭൂരിപക്ഷത്തെ പ്രതിനിധിയെ കാണാൻ സാധിക്കില്ല. പിന്നെ ഭാഷ എടുക്കാം. ലെറ്റ്സ് ടേക്ക് ലാംഗ്വേജ്. The Constitution of India recognizes 23 official languages in its rupee notes. നമ്മളൊരു വലിയ നോട്ടിനെ തുറന്നാൽ 23 ഭാഷയിലാണ് നമ്മളുടെ നിങ്ങൾ കോൺസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷൻ പ്രകാരം, നമ്മുടെ ഭരണഘടന പ്രകാരം അതിൻ്റെ വില എഴുതിയിരിക്കണം. പക്ഷെ ശരിക്കും പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ 35 ഇന്ത്യൻ ഭാഷകളുണ്ട്. There are 35 Indian languages which are spoken by more than 1 million people. 10 ലക്ഷം സംസാരിക്കുന്നതിനേക്കാൾ കൂടുതൽ 35 പേരുണ്ട്. 35 മില്യൺ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ 3.5 കോടി ജനങ്ങളുണ്ട്, പിന്നെ ഭാഷകളുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ and these are languages, by the way, their own scripts, their own grammatical structures, their cultural assumptions. I'm not just talking about dialects. If you look at dialects, there are 22,000 in our country today. So every Indian is speaking a minority language. because no language enjoys majority status in India. Thanks in part to the popularity of Bombay's Hindi cinema, Hindi may be understood, if not always well spoken, by half the population perhaps. But it's in no sense the language of the majority. Indeed, its locutions, its gender rules and script are unfamiliar to most Indians in the south or the northeast. അപ്പോൾ ഹിന്ദി നമ്മൾ പലരും ബോളിവുഡ് സിനിമകൾ കണ്ടിട്ട് കുറച്ച് ഹിന്ദി കേട്ട് മനസ്സിലാക്കാനുള്ള പഴക്കമുണ്ടാവും. പക്ഷേ നമ്മളെല്ലാവർക്കും എത്ര നന്നായി ഹിന്ദി സംസാരിക്കാൻ സാധിക്കുന്ന ഒരു സംശയം വേണ്ട നമുക്കറിയില്ല. ഒരു ഉദാഹരണമാണെങ്കിൽ ഹിന്ദിയിൽ ലിംഗ് ഉണ്ട്, നമ്മളുടെ മലയാളത്തിൽ ലിംഗം ഇല്ല. പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു ശബ്ദത്തിന് അത് പുരുഷൻ്റെ ശബ്ദമാണോ മഹിളയുടെ ശബ്ദമാണോ, ഹിന്ദിയിൽ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ എല്ലാ കാര്യവും ഒരു മേശയ്ക്കോ ഒരു കസേരയ്ക്കോ ഒരു കോസറയ്ക്കോ എല്ലാറ്റിനും ഒരു ജെൻഡർ ഉണ്ട്. അത് നമ്മുടെ ഭാഷയിലില്ല. അപ്പം നമ്മൾക്ക് അതിൻ്റെ ലോജിക്ക് മനസ്സിലാക്കാനേ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടാണ്. എന്തിൻ്റെ അടിസ്ഥാനത്തിലാണ് ഒരു കോസറി പിന്നെ മഹിളാ ജെൻഡറും ഒരു 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 മേശപ്പുറം ഒരു മെയിൽ ജെൻഡറും എന്താ അതിൻ്റെ ലോജിക്ക് നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടായിരിക്കും. അപ്പോൾ ഏത് മലയാളിയും എത്ര നന്നായി ഹിന്ദി പഠിച്ച് വിദ്വാനാണെങ്കിലും ഇതിൽ ഈ കാര്യത്തിൽ തെറ്റുണ്ടാക്കുന്നത് ഞാൻ തന്നെ കണ്ട് അനുഭവിച്ച കാര്യങ്ങളാണ്. അപ്പം ഞാൻ എന്തിനാണ് ഇത്ര വ്യത്യാസങ്ങളെക്കുറിച്ച് ഞാൻ ചൂണ്ടിക്കാണുന്നത്? Why am I harping on these differences? Only to make the point that Indian nationalism is a rare animal indeed. The idea of India, to use Tagore's famous phrase, is of one land embracing many. It is an idea that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume and custom, and still rally around a consensus, a democratic consensus. And that consensus is around the simple principle that in a democracy you don't really need to agree except on the ground rules of how you will disagree. Indian nationalism rejected the very idea that religion should be a determinant of nationhood. Our founders never fell into the insidious trap of agreeing that since partition had established a state for Muslims, what remained was a state for Hindus. That is not the Indian idea in the Constitution. To accept the idea of India, you had to spurn the logic that divided the country. അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് രണ്ട് ഉദാഹരണം തരികയാണെങ്കിൽ, പാകിസ്ഥാനിൻ്റെ എതിരെ 71 യുദ്ധം നോക്കിയാൽ ആ സമയത്ത് ചില പാകിസ്ഥാൻ ജനറൽമാരെ ഒരു മണ്ടത്തരം പറഞ്ഞു. ഇത് ഹിന്ദു ഇൻഫിഡലിൻ്റെ എതിരാണ് ഞങ്ങളുടെ യുദ്ധം, ജിഹാദാണെന്ന് അവർ പ്രഖ്യാപിച്ചു. പക്ഷെ ആ സമയത്ത് നമ്മുടെ ആർമി കമാൻഡർ ആരായിരുന്നു? ഒരു പാഴ്സിയായിരുന്നു, ജനറൽ മാനേക്ഷോ. നമ്മളുടെ എയർഫോഴ്സിൻ്റെ ചീഫ് ഓഫ് സ്റ്റാഫ് ആരായിരുന്നു? പിന്നെ ജനറൽ എയർ വൈസ് മാർഷൽ ജനറൽ ലത്തീഫ്. കുറച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് അദ്ദേഹം എയർ ചീഫും കൂടിയായി, എയർ ചീഫ് മാർഷലായി. നമ്മുടെ വെസ്റ്റേൺ ഫ്ലീറ്റ് നേവിൻ്റെ കമാൻഡർ ആരായിരുന്നു? അഡ്മിറൽ കുരുവില്ല, ഒരു മലയാളി ക്രിസ്ത്യൻ. ആരായിരുന്നു ജനറൽ ഓഫീസർ കമാൻഡിങ് ഈസ്റ്റേൺ കമാൻഡ്? അത് കൽക്കട്ട ബേസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ട് ഈസ്റ്റ് പാകിസ്ഥാനിൻ്റെ ആക്രമണം ചെയ്യാനും ബംഗ്ലാദേശിനെ സ്ഥാപിക്കാനും ആരായിരുന്നു? ജനറൽ ജസ്ജീത് സിംഗ് അറോറ, ഒരു സിഖ്. എന്നിട്ട് ആരെയാണ് അവർ ഹെലികോപ്റ്ററിൽ ഢാക്കയ്ക്ക് അയച്ചിട്ട് പാകിസ്ഥാനിൻ്റെ സറണ്ടർ വാങ്ങിപ്പിക്കാൻ ഒരു ജനറൽ അയച്ചത്? ജനറൽ JFR ജേക്കബ്, ഒരു ജൂയിഷ് ഭാരതീയൻ. ഇതാണ് ഇന്ത്യ. കാരണം ഈ ഏത് പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട റോളിലും ഒരു ഹിന്ദു ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. ഇവരെല്ലാവരും അവർ സ്വന്തം രാജ്യത്തിന് വേണ്ടിയായിരുന്നു ഈ സംഘർഷത്തിൽ, ഈ യുദ്ധത്തിൽ ഇറങ്ങിയിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. ഞാൻ 1971 യുദ്ധത്തിൽ നമ്മുടെ ഒരു കപ്പൽ മുങ്ങിപ്പോയത് അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു മെമ്മോറിയൽ ദീവ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു ചെറിയ ഒരു ദ്വീപമുണ്ട് ഗുജറാത്തിൻ്റെ കോസ്റ്റിൻ്റെ വഴി. ഞാൻ അവിടെ പോയി ആ മെമ്മോറിയൽ കണ്ടു. ശരിക്ക് അതിൽ മരിച്ച എല്ലാവരെയും പേരുകൾ, എല്ലാ സെയിലേഴ്സും സോൾജേഴ്സും എല്ലാവരും കപ്പലുണ്ടായിരുന്നവർ, തുടക്കം മുതൽക്ക് ക്യാപ്റ്റൻ മുല്ല വരെ മുതൽക്ക് അവസാനത്തെ വ്യക്തി വരെ ജീവിതം നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട പേരൊക്കെ വായിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മളുടെ കണ്ണിൽ നീര് വരും. എല്ലാ മതം, എല്ലാ ജാതി, എല്ലാ നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ഓരോരോ റീജൻസ്, ഓരോരോ പിന്നെ ഭാഗങ്ങൾ, ഓരോരോ വിധത്തിൻ്റെ പേരുകൾ എല്ലാം നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ സാധിക്കും. ആർക്കാണ് പറയാൻ സാധിക്കുക? ഏത് മതത്തിൻ്റെ വ്യക്തിയാണ് പറയാൻ പോകണം ഞാൻ ഈ രാജ്യത്തിന് വേണ്ടി എൻ്റെ രക്തം ചെലവാക്കിയിട്ടില്ല? Every Indian of every community has given his blood for the survival of our country. That is India, and that is the India that I celebrate. Now, I know there are some who don't agree with us. There are some who want India to become a Hindu Rashtra, a land often of the Hindu majority. And we've seen the horrors of this type of discourse that refuses to accept fellow Indians as equals, whether it be the 1984 riots against Sikhs, the destruction of the Babri Masjid by Hindu fanatics and the consequent riots, the attacks on the Kashmiri Pandits in the 1990s that made them flee their own state, the Gujarat killings of 2002, the killings that took place in Delhi in 2020, or the hate crimes we hear about on a daily basis, particularly against Muslims, Christians, and Dalits. As we speak today, Manipur is still burning, with many who have lost their lives, many churches and places of worship desecrated and utterly destroyed. When the idea of India is being challenged in this way, we must resist. And the notion of Indianness in today's world is well worth celebrating. Since I'm also a writer, let me end my remarks this morning with a story, but not one of my stories. It's a tale from our ancient Puranas. It's a typical ancient Hindu story of a sage and his disciples, where the sage asks his disciples, "When does the night end?" And the disciples say, "At dawn, of course." The sage says, "I know that. But when does the night end and the dawn begin?" The first disciple, who is from our state of Kerala, the tropical south, he replies, "Oh, I know, when the first glimmer of light across the sky reveals the palm fronds and the coconut trees swaying gently in the breeze above the paddy fields, that is when the night ends and the dawn begins." The sage says, "No." So the second disciple is from the cold north. He says, No, I know. It's when the first streaks of sunshine make the snow gleam white on the mountaintops of the Himalayas. That is when the night ends and the dawn begins. But the sage says, "No, my sons. When two travelers from opposite ends of our land meet and embrace each other as brothers, and when they realize they sleep under the same sky, see the same stars, and dream the same dreams, that is when the night ends and the dawn begins." Thank you. There's been many a dark night for India in the last century and a quarter that we've all experienced and studied and learned about. Have sown many seeds of hatred and division. By preserving the diversity that is the essence of our India, I believe that India can ensure that all its people can and will enjoy a new dawn in the years to come. Thank you all very much. May you all be blessed. Jai Hind.